This is FDR and the New Deal, Objective 2, about the policy goals of the second New Deal, which were attempts to create permanent recovery and reforms, unlike the Band-Aid measures of the first New Deal. The first of these measures was the NRA, and we're not talking about the National Rifle Association, we're talking about the National Recovery Act. This was the first major effort to combine immediate relief with long-range recovery and reform. It was a good attempt that ultimately failed, primarily because it required too much from labor and ownership. The National Recovery Act was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court for being unconstitutional, but that doesn't mean it didn't leave some legacies for later on. It required industries to create fair competition codes for all to follow. This included a maximum work week of 40 hours, extra pay for working overtime beyond 40 hours, and a minimum wage. The idea was to limit the number of hours that any individual laborer would work so that more people could be hired and therefore paid. And now you had twice as many people spending to boost the economy through demand, supply, and more jobs in all sorts of other areas. It also guaranteed labor the right to form unions and collectively bargain, which had been done before but was illegal, and choose their own representatives as opposed to having a mediator come in to represent them. It also got rid of what were called yellow dog contracts, contracts that owners would make new workers sign guaranteeing that they would never join a union. Unions saw that as cowardly, so they called them yellow dog contracts. And finally, it placed restrictions on child labor. Another important creation of the Second New Deal was the Public Works Administration, also known as the PWA. This spent $4 billion on 34,000 projects that included public buildings, highways, and parkways. Also the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River that you see in the slide here, the largest man-made structure since the Great Wall of China, at least back in those days. This generated more electricity and farmland irrigation than the Tennessee Valley Authority of the first New Deal had before it. The Second New Deal also got into housing projects through the United States Housing Authority, also known as the USHA. The United States Housing Authority lent money to states and communities for low-cost construction projects. There was no way for the supply to keep up with the demand. Everybody wanted one of these very affordable, low-cost homes, but it did put a lot of people to work in the construction industry. But the crown jewel of the Second New Deal might have been the Social Security Act of 1935, which is another thing for your timeline. This was a huge victory for the New Deal, providing for federal and state unemployment insurance and regular payments to elderly people and others who qualified for Social Security. It was financed by a payroll tax on both employers and employees, and even now today, if you look at your paycheck, you'll see that money is taken out to provide for the elderly of this time. The idea is that when we get old, the youth of that generation will supply money to us as well, and we just hope it'll be there for us once we get there. Okay, going back to labor unions for a second here. We know that the NRA was shot down by the U.S. Supreme Court, but that doesn't mean that the New Deal didn't have other policies toward labor unions as well, and they needed them. Unemployment had been going down, so labor unions were starting to feel more secure and more assertive, and walkouts and strikes were becoming very common by 1934, as workers kept demanding more and more rights and wages from owners. One of the most famous examples is something that I want you to add to your timeline, Bloody Thursday in San Francisco in 1934. Now, a lot of times when we hear about labor strikes, we hear about auto workers going on strike or steel workers or things along those lines. The San Francisco strike was a general strike, meaning that every occupation went on strike, not just this type or that type, but all occupations. It was essentially a 3-day period where the city of San Francisco just got completely quiet and totally shut down as nobody worked. Everybody was demanding better conditions from their owners, and eventually it was broken up by citizens using vigilante tactics. And this led to beatings and murders and accidental deaths and things across the board. It was one of the most violent strikes in American history. It was during this time that one of the most famous pieces of legislation in the New Deal came to be. The Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, something that I want you to add to your timeline. This basically was created after the Supreme Court had ended the National Recovery Act. The Wagner Act in the history of labor unions is often considered to be the Magna Carta of American labor. What it basically did was create the NLRB, also known as the National Labor Relations Board, and the idea behind this was to reassert the rights of unions to organize, collectively bargain, and pick their own representatives, something that had been a part of the National Recovery Act, but had been lost when the U.S. Supreme Court shot the National Recovery Act down. Another key component of the New Deal was the CIO, the Committee of Industrial Organizations, later known as the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It was organized by this guy, John L. Lewis, who at the time was the leader of the United Mine Workers. He basically organized the CIO from the ranks of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. Now again, in the beginning, this was called the Committee for Industrial Organizations, and it had 4 million members by 1940. This was obviously a huge step for organized labor, but there were some problems. The AFL was made up of skilled workers, craftsmen, people like that, people who had been trained with certain skills to do their job, skills that not everybody had. And they weren't always sympathetic to unions that were made up of unskilled workers. You know, basically, if you hand someone a shovel and tell them to dig, that's considered unskilled labor. The AFL didn't want those kind of workers in their ranks. And so the AFL suspended the CIO in 1936. They basically said, we don't want you to be a part of us anymore. Well, the AFL and CIO completely split in 1938, and the CIO then changed its name to the Congress of Industrial Organizations. One of the most common tactics of the CIO was the sit-down strike, which became the most famous in Flint and other Michigan auto factories, and then turned into a trend nationwide that workers would do. The basic idea here was to just sit down on the job and not move, read a magazine, whatever, to prevent new workers from coming in. The bottom line is that when those new workers came in to replace you, you could scare them off pretty quickly and keep production shut down until you got the wages and working rights that you wanted to have. CIO employees were also organized in steel factories. U.S. Steel gave them the right to organize before problems could arise, but smaller steel companies fought back. Now, this led to Chicago's Memorial Day Massacre in 1937 of steel workers that were trying to get their rights as well. But while the CIO was really important, what workers wanted the most were all of the provisions that had been lost from the old National Recovery Act. Now, the Wagner Act had recovered most of those aspects of the now defunct NRA, but a new action taken in 1938 called the Fair Labor Standards Act, something for your timeline, recovered most of the hours and wages aspects of the old NRA that the Wagner Act had not accounted for. So once again, you had a work week of 40 hours, extra pay for overtime, and a minimum wage designed to limit individual labor hours and hire more people to allow them to spend more. It also dealt with child labor a little more. Children under the age of 16 and under 18, if the occupation was dangerous, were not allowed to work. But it did not include any agricultural service and domestic workers, which meant that many African Americans, Mexican Americans, and women really didn't benefit from the Fair Labor Standards Act. But all in all, it brought back all of the provisions of the old NRA, something that labor unions liked. And like the first New Deal, there were policies towards farmers as well. Remember, in the late 1800s, farmers had mechanized and started really mass-producing crops. Well, they experienced a boom right after World War I and had been overproducing and dealing with low prices from the surplus ever since that time. When you throw in the Great Depression and 1 out of every 4 workers being unemployed, it meant that even less people were buying from farmers, and therefore many farms were foreclosed on because the farmers had used their farms as collateral to get the equipment to produce all the extra stuff. This led to one of the stranger policies of the New Deal from the Agricultural Adjustment Act, paying farmers not to farm. The idea of taxing industries who processed farm products and also having farmers burn their crops, pour out their milk, plow over their extra crop acreage to get rid of the surplus. If they got rid of the surplus, that meant that they could raise their prices of farm products. This was a good idea in theory, but not in practice. It was widely criticized, and ultimately it failed because the U.S. Supreme Court struck it down in 1936 after the tax was ruled unconstitutional. But a lot of things had taken place already. Cotton crops had been plowed under. Millions of pigs, because there was a surplus of pigs apparently, were slaughtered for fertilizer, grain, and corn crops were burned. Milk was poured out. Critics basically said, why get rid of food when people are starving? And the government said, well, because nobody's paying for it. There were other actions designed to help farmers. The Fraser-Lemke Farm Bankruptcy Act suspended farm foreclosures for 5 years. It didn't go through, it was voided, but a later law said that mortgages could be suspended for 3 years before farmers had to pay them back. As was the Resettlement Administration, created in 1935, designed to help farmers move to better land, to get them out of where they were. Now, why was this necessary? The main reason was something else for your timeline, the Dust Bowl, which started in 1933. It was the worst drought that the Great Plains has ever experienced and led to these terrifying storms of dry dust that just frequently hit. They were blizzards of dirt. As if things weren't bad enough, on top of everything else that was going on during the Great Depression, the good farmland in the plains was blowing away in these dirt blizzards after weeks of no rain and nearly tornado-force winds. Many people felt like it was the second coming of Christ and the end of the world, because you'd be driving along like this guy in the slide and the sky would just be black, the sun would be blocked out, as again these tornado-force winds would just kick up nothing but black dirt and giant storms of dry dust. Now, the Dust Bowl, in terms of an environmental disaster, was caused by nature but also caused by man. Boom years with high farm prices after World War I led to even more over-farming, like we had mentioned before. And out west, they used dry farming techniques. They didn't really use techniques that incorporated a lot of water. You don't need it for wheat and grain necessarily. But with those dry farming techniques, they used a lot of heavy machinery. All of these factors combined basically powdered the soil, and the drought was the last straw. When these storms would kick up, there was really no defense against it. Dunes would form. It would overrun your home. It was trying to, do everything you could to keep dirt from getting into your house as you put rags into every crevice and crack that you had in the building. And as a result, you lived like this. There's virtually no farmland left. The dust storms had blown everything over as the dunes had started to form. And if you're living in these conditions, it's very difficult to keep yourself healthy. You could put a wet rag over your face, but dust would still get in and you'd be coughing up mud balls. Adults and children who had never smoked in their lives were getting emphysema, including a lot of infants who had died very shortly after they were born in the Great Plains from North Dakota all the way down to Texas. If you didn't die, a lot of times you'd have the lung-associated diseases like emphysema that would go along with it, and pretty soon people just decided to quit. They were just fed up and couldn't live there anymore. These people that left were often referred to as Okies, or people leaving Oklahoma. Now, of course, they were leaving all sorts of states, and Okies became the name for anyone who was leaving the Dust Bowl, who would just pack up whatever they could and get out of there any way they could, looking for a better life somewhere else. Oftentimes, this meant traveling to California, and approximately 350,000 Okies fled the Dust Bowl for California with as many belongings as they could pack in their pickup trucks, junkyards on wheels, as they were called. The problem was, once they got to California, they found that it wasn't much better there, as work was pretty hard to come by. The plight of the Okies was made the most famous, most likely, in something else for your timeline here, John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, in 1939, which was all about the Okies who had left the Dust Bowl and gone to California. The book was later made into a feature film, and you can see a scene from the movie right here on this slide, your standard junkyard on wheels of the Okies going west. The New Deal was also trying to help Native Americans through the efforts of John Collier, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Collier wanted to reverse the forced assimilation policies of the 1887 Dawes Act, which had taken place during the Plains Wars, and as a result created the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This is also known as the Indian New Deal, and encouraged tribes to establish self-government and preserve traditions. Now, as nice as that was, as you can imagine, it got snowed under by a lot of the other policies of the New Deal that the masses often felt were more important, unfortunately. That's it. Thanks for listening.